It was a sunny afternoon in the heart of Willow Creek Park, where families laughed, joggers passed by, and children played on the swings. A soft breeze carried the scent of blooming flowers, creating an almost serene atmosphere. For Maya Carter, it was her favorite spot to unwind. A quiet bench under a tall oak tree where she could catch up on her favorite novel, away from the pressures of her demanding career. Dressed casually in jeans and a loose sweater, she looked like any other park-goer, blending effortlessly into the peaceful scenery. But that peace didn't last long. Two police officers patrolling the park noticed her sitting alone. To them, something about Maya didn't sit right. Maybe it was her calm demeanor, her confident posture, or perhaps it was the color of her skin. Whatever the reason, they approached her with an air of authority, their voices loud enough to turn heads. "Excuse me, ma'am. Mind telling us what you're doing here?" Officer Grayson asked, his tone teetering on suspicion. His partner, Officer Jenkins, stood a step behind, scanning the area as if waiting for trouble. Maya glanced up from her book, startled but composed. "Just reading," she replied calmly, lifting her novel as proof. Grayson crossed his arms, his gaze narrowing. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in the area. Can I see some ID?" Maya hesitated, her instincts telling her this interaction wasn't about suspicious activity. Still, she reached into her bag to retrieve her wallet. "Suspicious activity? In a park full of families?" she asked, keeping her tone even. Jenkins stepped closer. "We're not here to argue, ma'am. Just show us your ID." As Maya handed over her driver's license, a small crowd began to gather, sensing tension in the air. Some whispered among themselves, while others pulled out their phones, recording the scene. Grayson examined her ID, his lips pressing into a thin line. "Where are you from, Miss Carter?" "Why does that matter?" she asked, her patience beginning to wane. "Answer the question," Jenkins interjected sharply. Maya took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I live here. I've lived here for years. This is my neighborhood park." But her explanation didn't seem to matter. Grayson and Jenkins exchanged a glance before one of them muttered, "Let's take this downtown." "Excuse me?" Maya asked, rising to her feet. Before she could protest further, they were cuffing her hands behind her back, their actions as swift as they were unjust. The small crowd erupted in outrage, voices calling out questions and accusations. Maya's heart pounded, not out of fear, but from the sheer disbelief of the situation. As the officers led her away, a woman from the crowd shouted, "She didn't do anything. Let her go." Another chimed in, "You can't just arrest someone for sitting in a park." But the officers ignored them, their focus fixed on their detainee. Maya's mind raced as they pushed her into the back of the squad car. She could have revealed who she was, her profession, her authority, but something stopped her. She wanted to see how far they would take this, how deeply their biases ran. Little did they know, Maya Carter wasn't just anyone. She wasn't a helpless victim or a random person without recourse. She was Judge Maya Carter, one of the most respected legal minds in the state. And as fate would have it, she was the judge assigned to a pivotal case involving these very officers. A case that could determine their careers, their reputations, and their freedom. As the car pulled away, Maya looked out the window, her face unreadable, but her resolve unshaken. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And when the time came, these officers would learn exactly who they had crossed. Here's the continuation of your story. The ride to the station was tense and quiet, except for the low hum of the engine. Maya sat in the back seat, her hands cuffed tightly, the metal digging into her wrists. She didn't say a word, her mind carefully cataloging every detail of the arrest. The officers' attitudes, their words, their demeanor. Her silence wasn't submission, it was strategy. Grayson glanced at her through the rearview mirror, his eyes sharp and assessing. "You don't seem too worried," he said, trying to provoke a reaction. Maya met his gaze in the mirror, her expression calm but unreadable. "Should I be?" she asked evenly. Jenkins snorted. "People like you always think they can talk their way out of trouble. Let's see how far that gets you." Maya's jaw tightened, but she remained quiet. She had faced worse than these two. Still, she couldn't ignore the sting of their words, the implication that she didn't belong, that her presence in the park was inherently suspicious. It was a reminder of how far society still had to go, even in the most progressive of cities. As they pulled into the station's parking lot, Maya mentally prepared herself for what was to come. The building loomed large and grey, its exterior as unwelcoming as the officers escorting her. When they led her inside, heads turned, officers and staff glancing at her with varying degrees of curiosity and indifference. They processed her quickly, taking her fingerprints and mugshot. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly, casting a harsh glare on everything below. Maya noticed how Jenkins and Grayson seemed to enjoy the power they wielded, the way they spoke to her, as if she were beneath them. It wasn't the first time she had encountered this type of behavior, but experiencing it firsthand, as someone stripped of her authority and judged solely by her appearance, was infuriating in a way she couldn't quite put into words. "All right, Miss Carter," Grayson said, his voice laced with mock politeness. "You'll sit tight here while we sort things out." They placed her in a holding cell, the bars cold and unyielding. Maya sat on the hard bench, her back straight and her gaze forward. She didn't know how long they planned to keep her there, but she was willing to wait. As the minutes stretched into hours, Maya replayed the events in her mind. She thought about the park, the baseless accusations, the smug satisfaction on the officers' faces when they cuffed her. She wasn't just angry, she was determined. This wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had ever been mistreated, every unjust arrest, every abuse of power. Outside the cell, Grayson and Jenkins were at their desks, laughing and chatting as if their actions were routine, nothing out of the ordinary. They didn't know the storm they were about to unleash. Meanwhile, Maya's thoughts drifted to her career. She had worked tirelessly to become a judge, overcoming countless obstacles along the way. Growing up, her parents had instilled in her the importance of justice and fairness. Her father, a retired civil rights lawyer, had always told her, "The system only changes when people inside it refuse to accept its flaws." She had taken those words to heart, dedicating her life to being a force for change. But now, sitting in this cell, Maya couldn't help but wonder how many others had been in her position, falsely accused, treated unfairly, their voices silenced. Her thoughts were interrupted by a commotion outside the holding area. She could hear raised voices, one of them familiar. "What do you mean you arrested her?" A man's voice demanded, his tone sharp with disbelief. "Sir, please calm down," another voice said, trying to defuse the situation. Maya stood and approached the bars, craning her neck to see what was happening. Moments later, the source of the commotion came into view. It was her colleague, Attorney David Lawson, a prominent defense lawyer and one of her closest friends. When David saw her in the cell, his face hardened. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered, turning back to the officer who had been trying to placate him. "You're telling me you arrested Judge Carter *. On what grounds?" Grayson and Jenkins appeared then, their smug expressions faltering slightly at David's presence. "Sir, we were just doing—" David wasn't having it. "Your job. Your job is to uphold the law, not harass innocent people. Do you have any idea who you just put in that cell?" Jenkins crossed his arms. "We don't treat anyone differently, no matter who they are." David laughed humorlessly. "Oh, I'm sure you don't. But let me tell you something. When this gets out, you're going to wish you had." Maya watched the exchange silently, a small part of her appreciating David's fiery defense. But she also knew this wasn't the time to reveal her hand. She wanted to see how far they were willing to go, how deeply their bias and arrogance ran. After several more tense minutes, David turned to her. "Maya, are you all right?" She nodded. "I'm fine, David. Thank you for coming." "We're getting you out of here," he said firmly. But before he could make any calls or demand her release, a higher-ranking officer entered the room. Captain Reynolds was a no-nonsense man with years of experience, and his expression darkened as he took in the scene. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice commanding. Grayson stepped forward, trying to explain, but Reynolds held up a hand to silence him. He walked over to Maya's cell, studying her with a mix of recognition and surprise. Judge Carter, he said finally, his tone shifting to one of respect. I didn't realize it was you. Apparently not, Maya replied, her voice steady. Reynolds sighed heavily, turning back to Grayson and Jenkins. Do you have any idea what you've done? She was acting suspicious, Jenkins said defensively. Reynolds shot him a sharp look. Suspicious? Sitting on a park bench is suspicious now. Grayson opened his mouth to speak, but Reynolds cut him off. Enough. Release her. Now. As they unlocked the cell and removed the cuffs, Maya stepped out, her posture as dignified as ever. She looked at Grayson and Jenkins, her gaze unwavering. This isn't over, she said softly, her words carrying the weight of a promise. David placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Let's get out of here, he said. As they left the station, the weight of what had happened settled heavily on Maya's shoulders. But she wasn't defeated. Back at her home, Maya sat at her desk, surrounded by stacks of case files and legal briefs. Normally, this was her sanctuary, a place where she could focus and think clearly. But tonight, her mind was clouded with frustration and anger. She opened her laptop and began drafting a detailed account of what had happened, including every word and action she could remember. She knew the importance of documenting everything while it was still fresh in her mind. The next morning, Maya's story was all over the news. Headlines like asterisk respected judge wrongfully arrested by local police asterisk and asterisk racial profiling scandal rocks police department asterisk dominated the airwaves. Maya had expected the media attention, but she wasn't prepared for the flood of messages that followed. Her inbox was filled with emails, some supportive, others angry or dismissive. People from all over shared their own experiences with discrimination and mistreatment, thanking her for speaking out. But there were also messages from critics, accusing her of overreacting or using her position for personal gain. Maya ignored the negativity and focused on the voices that mattered, the ones that reminded her why she had chosen this path in the first place. Meanwhile, at the police department, the atmosphere was anything but calm. Captain Reynolds had launched an internal investigation into Grayson and Jenkins, and tensions were running high. Some officers defended their colleagues, insisting they were just doing their jobs. Others distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with the growing scandal. Grayson and Jenkins, however, showed no signs of remorse. In fact, they seemed emboldened, convinced that they would come out unscathed. She's just trying to make a name for herself, Jenkins scoffed during a private conversation with Grayson. She won't follow through. Grayson nodded, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. Deep down, he knew they had crossed the line. And now, with their trial looming, he couldn't shake the feeling that their actions were catching up to them. Back in her chambers, Maya reviewed the case files with a renewed sense of purpose. She read through witness statements, analyzed evidence, and carefully considered the arguments presented by both sides. As much as she wanted justice, she knew she had to approach the case with fairness and impartiality. Her personal experience with Grayson and Jenkins couldn't cloud her judgment. But that didn't mean she wouldn't hold them accountable. Outside the courtroom, the community was buzzing with anticipation. Activists organized rallies, demanding police reform and greater accountability. Families shared their own stories of injustice, their voices growing louder with each passing day. Among them was a young woman named Rachel Porter, whose brother had been a victim of police misconduct. She reached out to Maya, sharing her story and offering her support. Maya listened intently, moved by Rachel's determination to seek justice for her brother. Their conversation sparked an idea in Maya's mind. She began reaching out to local organizations, gathering resources, and building a network of advocates. This wasn't just about one case or two officers. It was about creating a system that worked for everyone, not just a select few. As the days turned into weeks, the tension continued to build. Grayson and Jenkins grew more defensive, their lawyers scrambling to build a case in their favor. Maya remained focused, determined to see the trial through without letting her emotions get the best of her. But the closer they got to the trial date, the more complicated things became. Anonymous threats began arriving at Maya's office, vague warnings meant to intimidate her into stepping down. She reported them to the authorities, but it only strengthened her resolve. She refused to be silenced. By the time the trial began, the courtroom was packed with spectators, journalists, and community members. The air was thick with anticipation, everyone waiting to see how it would unfold. Maya took her seat at the bench, her expression calm and unreadable. Grayson and Jenkins sat at the defense table, their faces a mixture of defiance and unease. Their lawyer spoke confidently, but Maya could see the cracks in their facade. As the proceedings began, Maya reminded herself of her duty to seek the truth, to uphold justice, and to ensure that the system worked for everyone, not just those in positions of power. The case was just beginning, and the stakes had never been higher. As the trial moved forward, the tension inside the courtroom was almost palpable. Each day, more evidence came to light, painting a picture of Grayson and Jenkins that was far from flattering. Witnesses took the stand, recounting instances of the officers' excessive force and questionable tactics. Videos were presented, grainy, shaky clips recorded by bystanders, that showed moments where their behavior went beyond what could be justified as standard procedure. Maya sat silently, a gavel resting before her, listening intently to every word. On the outside, she maintained a calm, professional demeanor, but inside she felt the weight of the case pressing down on her. It wasn't just about the law anymore, it was about trust. Trust in the system, trust in accountability, and trust that justice could be served. The defense worked hard to counter the allegations. Grayson and Jenkins' lawyer argued that their actions were misinterpreted, that they were just following protocol in high-pressure situations. These are officers who risk their lives every day, the lawyer said, pacing in front of the jury. They make split-second decisions to protect their community. Are they perfect? No, but are they guilty of the misconduct they're being accused of? Absolutely not. Maya observed the jury closely as the lawyer spoke. Some members nodded slightly, while others appeared skeptical, their expressions unreadable. She knew that the jury's decision would hinge on whether they believed the officers' actions were justified, or whether they saw a pattern of abuse and dishonesty. The prosecution, however, had its amaze up its sleeve. Late one afternoon, as the courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs, the lead prosecutor announced that they would be calling a surprise witness. The doors swung open, and a man stepped in, his presence commanding immediate attention. It was Officer Marcus Reed, a veteran of the force and a former colleague of Grayson and Jenkins. He had a reputation for being fair, level-headed, and deeply committed to justice. As he took the stand, the room fell silent, every eye fixed on him. Reed began his testimony carefully, his voice steady but filled with emotion. He described working alongside Grayson and Jenkins, detailing incidents that had troubled him for years. There were times, he said, when I saw things I couldn't ignore. Actions that went against everything we were taught as officers. I spoke up when I could, but the culture in the department made it clear. Keeping quiet was the safer choice. His words sent a ripple through the courtroom. Maya watched Grayson and Jenkins closely, noting the way their expressions hardened, their eyes darting toward each other. For the first time, they seemed genuinely rattled. Reed went on to describe specific incidents, including one that mirrored the events of Maya's own arrest. He detailed how Grayson and Jenkins had stopped individuals in the park without cause, targeting people based on little more than assumptions. It wasn't about keeping the community safe, Reed said. It was about control, about showing people who was in charge. The jury hung on every word, and Maya felt the weight of Reed's testimony settle heavily in the room. It was a turning point, one that made it clear this case wasn't just about two officers. It was about a culture that allowed their behavior to go unchecked. Outside the courtroom, the city was alive with protests and rallies. The case had ignited a firestorm of public debate, with people on both sides voicing their opinions. Some defended the officers, arguing that they were being unfairly targeted in a political battle. Others demanded sweeping reforms, calling for justice not just in this case but in the entire system. Maya avoided the media frenzy as much as she could, focusing instead on the task at hand. But she couldn't ignore the impact the trial was having. Each evening, as she walked to her car, she saw the crowds gathered outside the courthouse, holding signs and chanting slogans. Their voices were a reminder of what was at stake, and they gave her the strength to keep going. The defense, desperate to regain control, attempted to discredit Reed's testimony, suggesting he was a disgruntled former officer with a vendetta. They brought in their own witnesses, officers who spoke in favor of Grayson and Jenkins, painting them as hardworking and dedicated. But the cracks in their narrative were becoming harder to ignore. More evidence surfaced: emails, internal reports, and testimonies from other officers who had chosen to remain anonymous. Each piece added to the growing picture of misconduct and abuse of power. As the trial neared its conclusion, the tension reached its peak. Maya felt it in every moment: the anticipation, the uncertainty, the weight of the decision that lay ahead. She knew that whatever verdict the jury delivered, it would send a message. And that message would echo far beyond the walls of her courtroom. On the final day of testimony, the prosecution called one last witness, Rachel Porter. Her brother's story was one of many that had come to light during the trial, a tragic example of what could happen when accountability was absent. Rachel spoke with quiet strength, her voice steady despite the emotion behind her words. She described the pain of losing her brother, the frustration of fighting a system that seemed designed to protect those in power. "I'm here," she said, looking directly at the jury, "because this can't keep happening. We deserve better. Our communities deserve better." The room was silent as she stepped down from the stand, her words lingering in the air like a challenge. That evening, as Maya prepared for the next day's closing arguments, she found herself reflecting on everything that had led to this moment. The trial wasn't just about justice for one person or punishment for two officers. It was about the kind of future they wanted to build. And tomorrow, as the jury deliberated, the weight of that future would hang in the balance. As the courtroom prepared for closing arguments, a palpable sense of anticipation filled the air. The trial had already shaken the community, revealing cracks in the foundation of trust between the police and the people they served. Maya could see it in the faces of the spectators, the way their eyes flicked between the prosecution and the defense, searching for clues about how it would all end. But just as the prosecution was set to deliver their closing remarks, an unexpected interruption sent shockwaves through the courtroom. A court officer entered quietly and approached the bench, whispering something to Maya. Her expression remained calm, but there was a flicker of surprise in her eyes. "I've just been informed," Maya announced, addressing the room, "that new evidence has been submitted. We will take a brief recess while I review it." A murmur of confusion rippled through the audience as Maya left the bench and retreated to her chambers. She sat at her desk, the new evidence spread before her. A sealed envelope containing a USB drive and a letter. The sender was anonymous, but the contents were damning. The drive contained bodycam footage for an incident involving Grayson and Jenkins. The timestamp revealed it was from the same day as Maya's arrest, but the location was different. A small alleyway just a few blocks from the park. The footage showed the officers stopping another individual, a young black man, and subjecting him to the same aggressive treatment Maya had experienced. What made the video even more shocking was the audio. Grayson's voice could be heard clearly, making remarks that were blatantly racist and dismissive. At one point, he turned to Jenkins, laughing as he said, "Just another one to keep in line. They don't respect authority until you remind them who's in charge." Maya's stomach churned as she watched, her hands gripping the edge of her desk. This wasn't just another instance of misconduct. It was proof of a pattern, an attitude that had likely influenced their behavior in countless other cases. When the recess ended, Maya returned to the courtroom, her expression unreadable. She informed both sides of the newly submitted evidence and allowed them time to review it. The defense was visibly shaken, their lawyer scrambling to mitigate the damage. "This footage is irrelevant," the defense argued when the trial resumed. "It's a separate incident that has no bearing on the events of this case." But the prosecution countered swiftly. This footage speaks directly to the officers' mindset and their pattern of behavior. It's critical for the jury to understand who these men are and how they operate. Maya deliberated for a moment before making her decision. The footage will be admitted as evidence. The jury will consider it alongside everything else presented in this trial. The courtroom buzzed with energy as the footage was played. The expressions on the jurors' faces ranged from shock to disgust, and even some members of the audience looked visibly shaken. Grayson and Jenkins sat stiffly at the defense table, their lawyer whispering furiously to them. But the revelations didn't end there. Later that afternoon, Rachel Porter returned to the stand, this time with a new piece of information. Through her network of activists, she had uncovered a series of internal complaints against Grayson and Jenkins. Complaints that had been quietly dismissed or buried by their superiors. These complaints show a clear pattern of behavior. Rachel testified, her voice steady but firm. These officers have been protected by a system that values loyalty over accountability. And the people who suffer the consequences are the ones who are supposed to feel safe in their own communities. The defense tried to dismiss the complaints as unsubstantiated, but the damage was done. The jury had seen enough to question not only the actions of the officers, but also the integrity of the system that has shielded them for so long. By the end of the day, the tension in the courtroom was at an all-time high. The weight of the new evidence and testimony loomed over everyone, casting a shadow over what had already been a contentious trial. But just as Maya was preparing to adjourn for the evening, another unexpected turn of events unfolded. A member of the jury, an older man who had remained quiet throughout most of the trial, suddenly raised his hand and requested to speak. "I don't know if this is appropriate," he said, his voice hesitant, "but I feel like I need to say something. I've lived in this city my whole life, and I've seen things I've never spoken about because I didn't think it would make a difference. But sitting here, listening to all of this, it's made me realize how important it is to face the truth." The courtroom fell silent, every eye on the juror as he continued. "I don't know how this trial will end, but I do know one thing. This isn't just about two officers. It's about all of us, and we can't keep pretending everything is fine when it's not." His words hung in the air, resonating deeply with everyone in the room. Maya felt a lump rise in her throat as she looked at the juror, grateful for his honesty, but acutely aware of the pressure his statement would add to an already charged situation. As she adjourned the court for the day, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that the trial was hurtling toward a breaking point. The stakes were higher than ever, and the resolution, whatever it might be, would leave an indelible mark on everyone involved. The city outside buzzed with speculation, the courthouse surrounded by reporters, activists, and curious onlookers. Inside, Maya prepared herself for what was to come, knowing that the hardest decisions were still ahead. The courtroom was electric on the final day of the trial. Every seat was filled, and the air buzzed with anticipation as the closing arguments began. The prosecution laid out a compelling case, highlighting the mountain of evidence and testimony that painted a damning picture of Grayson and Jenkins. These officers were entrusted with the responsibility to protect and serve. The prosecutor said, their voice unwavering. Instead, they abused that trust, targeting the very people they sought to protect. This case isn't just about their actions, it's about whether we, as a society, will hold them accountable. The defense, however, fought back with equal fervor. They doubled down on their narrative of misunderstanding and split-second decisions, painting Grayson and Jenkins as victims of a public eager to condemn. "We cannot judge these men based on emotions or public opinion," the defense attorney argued. "We must look at the facts and remember that they are innocent until proven guilty." The jury's deliberations stretched into the evening, leaving the courtroom in suspense. Outside, the crowd had swelled, with people chanting and holding signs that called for justice. Maya could hear the noise even in her chambers, a constant reminder of the weight this trial carried. Finally, the jury returned, their faces solemn as they filed into the courtroom. Maya took her seat, her heart steady but her mind racing. She glanced at the jury foreperson, who rose to deliver the verdict. "We, the jury, find the defendants, Officer Grayson and Officer Jenkins. The four-person pause, the silence in the room deafening. Guilty on all counts. The room erupted in a mix of cheers and gasps. Maya rapped her gavel, calling for order as the emotions in the courtroom spilled over. Grayson and Jenkins sat frozen, their faces pale as the weight of the verdict sank in. Their lawyer whispered to them urgently, but they didn't respond. Maya took a deep breath, addressing the courtroom with measured authority. This verdict is a reflection of the evidence presented and the voices of those who have been wronged. It is a reminder that no one is above the law and that accountability is not optional. As the courtroom began to clear, Maya felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion. The case had taken its toll on her, but she knew it was far from the end. This was just one step in a much larger fight for justice and reform. But as Maya was gathering her things to leave, a court officer approached her, their expression urgent. "Judge Carter, there's something you need to see," they said, handing her a small envelope. Maya opened it cautiously, finding a single sheet of paper inside. It was a printed email exchange between Grayson and an unknown sender. The subject line read, "*the park incident*, and the contents made Maya's blood run cold. The email revealed that the officer's actions weren't just the result of individual bias. They had been acting on orders from higher up. The message referenced a directive from someone within the department, encouraging targeted stops in certain neighborhoods to send a message. Maya's mind raced as she processed the implications. This wasn't just about two rogue officers. It was about a system that had condoned and even encouraged their behavior. The trial had uncovered a small part of the truth, but the real fight was only beginning. As she left the courthouse that night, the crowd outside erupted into cheers when they saw her. Maya raised a hand in acknowledgement, but her thoughts were elsewhere. The verdict was a victory, but the revelation in the email was a stark reminder of how much work remained. Walking to her car, Maya felt a renewed sense of purpose. The system wasn't going to change overnight, but she was determined to be a part of that change. The story of Grayson and Jenkins wasn't just about two men. It was about a culture of accountability, justice, and the power of people to demand better. And as she drove away, the envelope sitting on the passenger seat beside her, she knew this was far from over. The fight for justice had only just begun, and she was ready for whatever came next.